Welcome back. It is June 15 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Lesson 2 from Brentano on descriptive psychology. We're going to look entirely at the second moment of consciousness at the level of perception, and then we'll look briefly at the third moment. But basically, Brentano says that consciousness does form a unity of reality, of the true or the real, as an enclosure of a multitude of parts. The parts are distinctive. They can be separated out for analysis, but eventually we will reach a foundational level of distinctive parts for human consciousness. Partitioning can take place at the foundational level, and they will be very distinct partitions. Now, perceptive consciousness does divide a scene into spatial particularity and qualitative particularity, and it's the qualitative particularity that we internalize. We also evaluate the structure as a generic logical necessity or a specific logical evidence of difference. So there are a multitude of parts, but Brentano says there's basically four partitioned areas in consciousness at the level of perception. There are mutually pervading distinctions, there are logical distinctions, there's the correlation between the objective object and our psychical internal representation, and then there's the secondary psychical relations of how the subjective and the objective correspond to each other. Now we do evaluate the scene with four mutually pervading qualities. We ask, what is it affirming? How is it being directed? What is its trajectory? Is it a self-evident reality? Is it a necessity or is it contingent? And then in addition to this, Brentano says that at every level of consciousness, some intentionality is involved. So it is also an intentional relation that we define. The objective and the subjective may not correspond to each other. They may reflect some difference. That difference might be our intentionality that we have overlaid on our representation. But it does create an area of secondary psychical relations of correspondence that end up being involved in our representation. So Brentano says we do enter into a coexistence in consciousness, even at the very basic level of perception. There's a connection between that objective reality and our psychical representation, even at the level of perception. And he says every act of consciousness is innately reflexive, not as a complete self-consciousness. He's not talking about self-consciousness here, but it is reflexive, so perception still will lead to a gaze directed towards the self, even though it's not a formal self-consciousness. In fact, he calls it, rather than self-consciousness, it is coexisting in consciousness at the level of perception. But it will involve some degree of intentionality. Some degree of intentionality is added even at the level of the very basic, elementary level of perception. But that coexisting consciousness is that which unifies the mutual pervading categories of truth, the logical structure, that correlate between the object and our psychical internalization, and all of those secondary relational areas of correspondence. All of that gets enclosed in that coexisting consciousness, and so at the level of perception, there isn't a formal self-consciousness. There is instead a very primitive form of an emerging self-consciousness, but it's more of a coexistence in consciousness along with perception. It's just simply a very non-involved reflexivity that's more of an unconscious reflexive moment, but it does form that unifying base that can enclose those four partitioned key areas of distinction. And for Brentano, perception always breaks down to a foundation of those four partitioned areas, and so we can always relate to perception by understanding how those four partitioned areas come together as a unity to form that first primitive image of perception that we will carry eventually to the dialogue threshold when we want to refine it on to a more sophisticated self-reflective self-consciousness. But at the level of perception, it simply exists as a coexistence in consciousness of a unified, four-part partitioned area of perception. So he gives us a little bit more detail. He's getting into his system here a little bit. But he starts out at the level of the unconscious. He starts out at the level of perception that is basically, quite a bit more intuitive, and there's no real deeply cognitive self-consciousness going on. It's more of basically apprehending the distinctions and gathering them into an elementary unity, which is kind of a primitive perceived